Good afternoon. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our conversation about a new chapter in transatlantic relations. I'm really delighted to be able to have this conversation for many reasons, and I'll introduce our speakers to you in a moment. But, probably of the sessions on our agenda for this week, this is the one that comes closest most directly to the GMF mission, which is, of course, strengthening transatlantic relations. And we've had a very exciting week here for transatlantic relations. 3 successive summit meetings, the G7, the NATO summit, the US-EU summit, an important first trip for President Biden to Europe. So a lot to talk about. And we have wonderful people to join us for this conversation to talk about it. And let me introduce them to you. First, we have Niels Aanen, who's joining us actually from Hamburg today, who is Minister of State in the Federal Foreign Office in Berlin. Also, Rosa Balfour is Director of Carnegie Europe here in Brussels as well. And Anthony Gardner, Senior Advisor at the Brunswick Group and former US Ambassador to the European Union, joining us, I'm very happy to say, from Tuscany today. So welcome to all 3 of you. Thank you very much for being with us. Maybe I could start out, with a very basic question. What did we see this week? What did we see this week? Niels, maybe I could turn to you first.
Well, Ian, first of all, great to be with you. I'm happy to join our discussion. I think we see a real change in attitude. I mean, the president, the American president, repeatedly talked about the fact that America is back. And in a way, if you look at the sequence, which is very interesting, not the G7, so some would still say, and I would join them, the core group of Western democracies. Then we had the EU, USA, and the NATO summit, which all then culminated in the meeting, the summit that President Biden had with Vladimir Putin. And so he did not only went to Geneva to see Putin, but he went there, I think, with the renewed support of like-minded countries. And that is significant. And of course, everybody was listening very carefully. And I assume that I was maybe not the only one. And for us Europeans, I think the message of President Biden, the way he framed the relationship between the European Union and the United States was indeed significant and marked also a clear difference to the message that former Secretary Pompeo had, I think, by the way, Ian, on a platform provided by GMF, which was kind of painful for me to watch those days. But I think that's very significant. Is it going to solve all the problems and the tensions and disagreements? Probably not. And we should remind ourselves that, because of the 4 terrible years we had under the Trump administration, people tend to look with a certain romanticism to the transatlantic relationships before Trump. It was always different countries with national interests, but with a basic foundation of values. And I think we are back to that reality. We need to have a realistic view also on some trade issues, some policy issues, a lot of work to be done, but we are back in the game together, and it was about time.
Niels, thanks very much. Rosa, do you agree? I mean, the US back, enthusiasm justified, worries allayed. How do you see it?
I think the message was very strong, very powerful, very positive, well received. It's actually quite striking how rigorous and coherent the message from the US is. And there's a very strong dimension. There's America's back, but there's also America's back, but is also listening to partners. And I think that it's these dual messages that have come through. On the EU side, I think we have seen a proactive engagement rather than a wait and see engagement. Europeans, the EU came to the summit with some very concrete proposals and decisions were made, which is also a big step forward, certainly compared to the past 4 years. And that's a bit the metric that we're using. Perhaps, it's a different time respect to what Niels Aanen was referring to, sort of nostalgia to a pre-Trump era. We're in a different moment, and I think that is evident on both sides of the Atlantic. Biden also came with another very strong message, and that is that global politics are evolving along a trajectory which is really focused on democracies versus authoritarianism. And while I think the language is very compelling and the analysis is very compelling, I think the framing might be a little bit difficult for Europeans. So I think, you know, if I'm thinking of what is there to come, the answer is we've agreed to talk with the Americans. There's going to be a lot more engagement, a lot more dialogue, and many more things that can be done together. But there will continue to be unease over certain difficult topics. And the framing of global politics along the axes of democracy versus authoritarianism, while I think it's a very appropriate analysis for today's world, it might sit a bit uneasily in certain national capitals in Europe because there's a tradition of more nuanced, shall we say, nuanced approach to international politics, more cautious approach to certain countries such as China and Russia, we might as well mention them, and a tradition of a diplomatic history of engagement, of dialogue, of avoiding confrontation. Whereas Biden's real ask from Europeans and from its allies is actually to come forward with more forceful policies to confront the rise of China, to confront the aggressiveness of these authoritarian countries. So that's where I see the difficult spots ahead. It doesn't mean that the US and the EU and other partners cannot cooperate. Of course they can. The conversation has started again, and it has started around very pragmatic issues, but still, as you said, you know, there's also some background noise which will become more serious issues in the months to come.
Rosa, thanks very much. And we do want to come back to the background noise and also some bigger structural issues that may be on the horizon. But Tony, maybe I could turn to you now. And, you know, one of the things that strikes me, and I'd be interested if you agree, is that one very fundamental difference between the Biden administration and its predecessor is that it takes the EU as an institution seriously, even if we aren't always on the same page. I mean, would you agree with that? But also more generally, how do you read the last week?
Oh, well, absolutely agree with it. You know, and I wasn't at the speech that Pompeo gave that you hosted GMF, but I was at the prior speech that John Kerry gave in the same venue, by the way, the Conseil Noble. And those are two interesting speeches to compare because it tells you everything you need to know about how the two administrations viewed multilateralism rules in the EU. So of course, this administration, thank God, is taking the EU seriously as a partner. But to get to the point, Ian, so I'm a happy camper. You know, 5 months into this administration, a lot of what we had worked on, many people on the campaign, I was involved in a working group on the EU, are being done. And I'm thinking of Boeing Airbus. You know, I'm very happy to see that agreement looks like it will be solved. The tax proposals, you know, we're not there, we're not done. It's got to go to the G20, and it'll, you know, hopefully be implemented at the OECD by the end of the year. But that's a super big deal. For so many reasons. And of course, we're not done in the sense that bits of it have to go through the US Congress and there's some negative noises, but you know, it's still a big deal. And then, you know, there are other things that have happened which are useful. There are some frictions that are still outstanding, for sure, like the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum haven't been resolved. We have written about that in the campaign, but I see that the summit communique is giving the parties until the end of the year to try to solve that. There's some frictions about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. There are, you know, frictions about public procurement, which are not new, but related in part to the infrastructure plan that the president has laid out. And of course, Privacy Shield needs to be fixed. So there are problems, but I'm a happy camper, Ian. And I even see alignment on China, which I know we're going to get to in a second. And I'm happy to see that the summit communique gave substantial space to the Trade and Tech Council, which I've written about and feel very strongly about, particularly with regard to technology standards cooperation, which has, I think, been underestimated as a very, very important issue, particularly relating to China.
Tony, before we move on, maybe I could just play off of something you just mentioned. One hears here sometimes a concern about growing economic nationalism, actually on both sides of the Atlantic, when President Biden talks about a foreign policy for the middle class, or President Macron talks about a Europe or a France that protects. They're talking about somewhat of the same thing, and it doesn't necessarily bode well for those, for example, who would like to see a revived TTIP or something of that kind. How do you see that playing out?
Well, I'm relatively more relaxed than some of the people who love to get, all worked up about this issue. It's one thing, and a perfectly legitimate thing can be concerned about protecting our citizens. And you made, I think, the difference in between protection and protectionism. They don't have to be the same thing. We want to protect our citizens in many ways, and as the Europeans who are feeling particularly vulnerable, I think now more than ever, being caught between these two giants, the US and China. So I have no problem with the language about protecting citizens. And by the way, I think we need to protect capitalism as well. Both sides of the Atlantic. We need to protect our capitalism, and we need to protect our democracies that are both at risk. So Trumpism is not just a US phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon, it's a European phenomenon. Where I get uncomfortable is when things veer, as they have, at least in some countries and some politicians who talk about protectionism and particularly targeting US companies. But I am relatively relaxed because I don't get worked up when some members of the European Parliament, and I won't say who, start pointing fingers at particular American companies and say, we need to target those five. A lot of people say a lot of things, so we need to be a little bit relaxed. We need to look at what the EU institutions are saying, the Commission is saying, what is the direction of travel? And on the whole, I'm relatively, okay.
Niels, let me come back to you on something. We just completed this year a most recent version of GMF's Transatlantic Trends survey, which we do with the Bertelsmann Foundation. And it has lots of fascinating things in it around not only how Europeans and Americans see themselves, but also about transatlantic relations. And one of the points in there is, of course, that Germany is widely seen as the most influential country in Europe. But there's also a bigger point about NATO. Something like 65% on average, Niels, of people who responded thought NATO was important to them, important to their own security. And given the mistrust in institutions these days, that's not really bad. How do you see this, especially if you like from a German context, also from a European context? Is NATO still the central thing when it comes to security, or has the aspiration for strategic autonomy and other things overtaken it?
Look, Ian, I don't believe that our contribution, for whatever you want to call it, European sovereignty, autonomy, I'm not so much into that debate about the right framing. But what we are doing to strengthen the European Union also in terms of defense is and should not be directed against NATO. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding. But what the numbers you're mentioning, they are interesting and somehow encouraging, because I had the impression over many, many years that in parts of the, at least West German society, NATO wasn't a topic anymore. Cold War was over, Germany was peacefully reunited, and we had, and probably we still have, different threat perceptions in Europe. But somehow the Trump years and President Trump's attitude towards NATO, both on the campaign trail, but then also as president, maybe even was a wake-up call, also for those in the German society who had the impression that it's maybe not necessary to look that much at NATO or to invest that much in NATO. And I think step by step you can see what Germany did after the annexation of Crimea, with the contribution, also a relevant, robust contribution to the reassurance package. Are we doing the air policing, the very high readiness joint task force? We just signed an agreement with NATO for a new headquarters. So I could continue that list. None of these activities were disputed in Germany, and it was sometimes overlooked a little bit, also in the transatlantic conversation. So, and Heiko Maas, my boss, our foreign minister, made a proposal which got picked up by the Secretary General and resulted in what I think a very good report presented by NATO to strengthen the political pillar. So NATO is getting more and more again into the focus of also of the German political debate. I believe that's a good thing.
What else should be on the agenda now? Obviously, we have a set of geopolitical, of hard security issues that are back and underscore the importance of NATO, also the importance of what the EU may choose to do in the defense area. But if you look at the survey that we just did, Transatlantic Trends, it's interesting the list of what people are concerned about across the Atlantic: global health, climate, trade, terrorism, the top four. I mean, does that surprise you at all? I mean, obviously the first one shouldn't surprise any of us given the experience we've had over the last year.
No, it doesn't surprise me. And I think the pressure is huge on our governments to act on all the fields that you mentioned. I see a very active leadership position that John Kerry and the Biden administration are taking, assuming and all what that has to do with climate diplomacy and the outreach to like-minded countries and the very substantial talks about the next steps, to include the big polluters like China and India. That's very encouraging. We're not always on the same page. For example, we don't believe that nuclear should be part of the package, but so we can talk about all those things, and time is of the essence, and we share that view. It's maybe in the long run, Ian, the most significant field of policy. And when it comes to health, I don't want to take too much of the time here, but I think the majority of the German population welcomed the announcement of President Biden when it comes to increased engagement in terms of fighting the pandemic. Some of the proposals raised some eyebrows here in Berlin. I'm in Hamburg, but I think it raised eyebrows in Berlin because if you say America is back, that's great, but we never left in a way. And it was also the German chancellor, the German government that was there at the beginning when COVAX was founded and funded, by the way. So I'm happy that the United States is joining in. But a little bit, it created the impression that, so now the Europeans need to step up. And I don't think that reflects what really happened. And we can go into the question whether or not enough vaccines really left the United States, because most of what COVAX did, it's not enough, I agree, but most of what COVAX did was only possible also because of European production. So we need to have a conversation about that, but in general terms, I think the results of your survey, they reflect the agenda that we have in Berlin as well.
Thanks, Niels. Rosa, let me come back to something that you said earlier, this tension between values and pragmatism, which is evident on both sides of the Atlantic, but perhaps in different measure on both sides of the Atlantic. Maybe say a little bit more about that. I mean, this is an administration, the Biden administration, that talks very openly about a democracy agenda, anti-corruption, the values side of our relationships, both the positive ones and the adversarial ones. Sort of that tension was fully on display in a way in the meeting with Putin as well. I mean, but how do you say that? You suggested that this might be something ultimately a little difficult on this European side of the Atlantic. Say a little more about that.
Yeah, no, I think, the first thing to say is that with the Biden-Putin meeting showed an important degree of pragmatism on the US administration side in moving forward in the relationship with Russia. You went in with lower expectations than those of past presidents and reset relations with Russia, et cetera, and with a very pragmatic agenda seeking to talk on certain critical matters, such as nuclear proliferation. So, I mean, this is life or death material. So it's good to see that pragmatism. So, and I think that's something Europeans appreciate, because that's also an approach that Europeans tend to follow. But at the same time, this narrative is being pursued. I think, as I said, it's analytically, I think it's a very persuasive narrative, because we have seen democracy being challenged, and therefore a need to protect, reform, and change our democracies. And I think the US actually domestically is taking some pretty radical steps in that respect, acknowledging the problems of its own polarization, acknowledging the problems of systemic and structural problems that we saw on 6th of January on Capitol Hill. So the US is really pushing forward an agenda where democracy is important internationally. We need to protect our democracies internationally, but we also need to reform them at home. So I think this narrative is very compelling. On the other side, we have this authoritarianism issue. And I think here, the big change is that we've had authoritarianism, of course. Authoritarianism has been on the rise, while democracy globally has been in decline. What has become more significant over the past a few years, and that Trump, I think, has accelerated, is an aggressiveness on part of authoritarian states, which are increasingly not just repressing internally, but also pursuing strategies for transnational repression, encroaching on the security and the autonomy of other states. This is happening in Asia, but it's happened, with the EU actually, with the hijacking of the plane, and of course with disinformation, misinformation, cyber attacks. So there's a fairly consistent attempt on part of authoritarian states to really undermine our democracies. So the struggle is there. There's no doubt about that. It has become much more acute and much more tense. I think the problem for the EU is that it's moving on a slightly different trajectory compared to the US. The EU has had a very principled and normative position on international relations, especially after the end of the Cold War. It has pursued a policy of democratization, supporting democracy abroad through its own enlargement and through the policies towards neighboring countries, which haven't been that successful, let's be honest. And since the rise of geopolitics, has embraced a much more pragmatic narrative of a view of global politics. Now the currency of EU language is principled pragmatism, a geopolitical commission. We need to learn to speak the language of power. And then comes an administration who's actually talking about values. And I think it's slightly cacophonous, the transatlantic relationship.
But doesn't what you're saying really tell us that this is really a story about convergence? Maybe not such an easy debate on either side of the Atlantic, but we wind up sort of in the same place.
Potentially. Europe needs to reconcile what is its strength to what is its values. I mean, that's basically, and the whole debate about strategic autonomy is identifying where Europe's strengths are and find a narrative and a vision for the world which is fitting to that. And I think this vision piece, we're not seeing it. We also see that the EU also has problems of democracy internally, but is not engaging in the same open debate that the US is doing. So it's in a slightly different space, but of course, the potential for convergence is huge, and the window of opportunity is potentially narrow because we don't really know what's going to happen in 2024 in the US. And of course, the EU is also subject to electoral cycles, some of which are challenging, shall we say. So
that's exactly what I wanted to ask about next. And maybe Tony, to start with you, there will be midterm elections. There will be presidential elections eventually. There are elections on the European side. I'd like to talk about that too. But just looking at the American side for the moment, I mean, do you sense that Europe has a degree of anxiety about the durability of the political shift that's taken place in the United States? That somehow Trumpism will outlast Trump in its foreign policy dimensions as well. Do you pick up some of that anxiety here?
Of course. And there should be anxiety, but it's not just an issue with the United States. There should be anxiety about the future of demographic populism in Europe. Just look internally. I mean, this is happening all over, everywhere we see. So there are no guarantees in any democracy, neither in the United States about what will happen in either the midterms or the next presidential election, nor in Europe. And the message is, I think, very clear. The message is that Europe has a stake in the future, even more now than before, in the in the success of this administration. Not to suggest that Europe is, nor should it be, in the business of giving handouts or freebies to the United States. No, but I would encourage all member states in the EU to believe that this Biden administration needs to succeed. And by that, I mean very specifically, and we did think about this a lot in the campaign, is to say, that, look, we have to prove the case to our domestic electorate that working with allies, working within the rules and multilateralism yields better results than doing it the Trump way, of doing it bilaterally, transactionally, and sometimes in a very, ill-tempered way. And if we fail to make that case, to show that we actually bring home better results, which, by the way, I don't think are inconsistent with better results for the world, then we're going to have a problem. So all of that to say, and it's, I know, blindingly obvious, that we have a short window of time. And I think it has very concrete results to state this obvious thing. For example, in the Trade and Tech Council, it's the time is ripe. But many of us on this call will remember that the Trade and Economic Council, the tech that was set up, that yielded almost nothing. So we need to make sure it's not overloaded. We need to focus on what is deliverable in a few years, Ian. And I would just urge both sides to do that. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay.
Excellent.
Sorry. All right.
And we're working on so that I can see you. In any case, let me pick up on something here with you, Niels. The points that were just made about this sort of lingering anxiety, with some reason about politics, frankly, on both sides of the Atlantic. But let's maybe talk for a moment about the United States. Niels, are you worried about the trajectory of American politics still?
Well, I'm pretty much focused right now on domestic German politics because I'm running to defend my seat in Parliament. But we can talk about the election maybe later. But there's a general worry, and I think what Tony said was, I think he said it was true, that the Trumpism is in a way a global phenomenon. And when I sit on the government's bench in Parliament, it's only like 3 meters because we are seated in front of the right-wing extremist AfD party. So I am listening to their comments, even those who are not reported in the minutes, because they talk among each other. And it's frightening to see that. So we need to strengthen our democracies together. Germany cannot solve the problem of populism in the United States, neither could the US solve our AfD problem, but we can put our strength together and work on our messages, exchange experiences. And for the European Union, I can only say, that what was and maybe still is our most important policy instrument, that is the credibility of the European model. It's the credibility of our democratic way. And by the way, also, the example that we have given, that pooling sovereignty actually works and on a global scale provides you with more legitimacy and sovereignty, instead of the comeback of geopolitics and the zero-sum logic. But if you have countries like Poland and Hungary and others who are undermining the very basis of freedom of speech and media freedom, the separation of powers, etc., that is maybe the biggest challenge that we are facing right now, because it's not only a problem for the affected population, it's also a problem to our credibility. So yes, we are following that very closely, sometimes excessively. You can ask policy wonks here in Germany, and they can tell you about districts in Georgia. It's maybe interesting, but it's also a little bit exaggerated. I think it also would make a lot of sense to try for all of us to try to learn a little bit more about maybe what is happening in China and Chinese politics to understand certain dynamics, but it's getting increasingly difficult to do that under the circumstances. But yes, we are almost following everything in the United States, and it's not a negative thing, but it's remarkable, and it's also reflected in the German press, by the way.
Yeah. No, Niels, I mean, thank you for that. I mean, what you've said, but also what others have said, really underscores the point that we're on both sides of the Atlantic, we're vested in the politics of the other and what happens, just as the US is vested in not just the history, but also the future of the European project. But you mentioned China. And we also have a number of questions that have come in from our audience. I would say at least half of them are about China. So I think we have license to talk about China. And of course, if you look, for example, at the dialogue, at the communiques that came out of the recent summits, maybe most striking from the NATO summit, there was a lot about China there. The China factor, how does that play in this? Will Europe and the United States be on the same page when it comes to China and its various domains? A complex question, obviously, but broad brush. Niels, let's stick with you. You're on screen.
Well, we need at least another 45 minutes, Ian, but I think, we tried to coordinate our policies with the Trump administration on China. It was close to be impossible. Of course, we had good conversations, on the working level, but it never really came to a political kind of consultation. We even made a public outreach in Washington, D.C. from our embassy. So believe me, we are very happy also to see that attention from D.C. towards a stronger coordination on China. And there is an experience in Germany in dealing with China. And there's also increasingly critical debate within the German society whether or not the general path was the right one. But I think basically we share the concerns about the authoritarianism, the increasing armament of the People's Liberation Army, the fact that Xi Jinping fundamentally changed the strategy of Chinese foreign policy. He abolished the policy of Deng Xiaoping of, never take the lead and keep a low profile, and that has global consequences. So we need to deal with that. But we also made the experience, and that is very closely connected with the chancellor as a person, that if you invest in that relationship with China, it's not impossible to make things happen. And it has been criticized, and we need to look into that very carefully, and every new government will do that. But there's also the part that sometimes it's not going to be published, what we did on human rights, for example, a structured dialogue with the Chinese. And we can and we must use that, not to pursue a national German policy, but to contribute to a stronger cohesion, not only on a transatlantic level, Ian, but also within the European Union. I think Germany needs to understand that there is suspicion among smaller countries because of our sometimes unique access to China. But I think our partners also need to understand, in order to make that work, a format like 17, or now it's like 16+1, is not acceptable. So there is a lot to do. It will be the topic at least for the next decade to come. And as China is also a strategic competitor and rival, and we are seeing that right now also in the COVID diplomacy, there's simply no alternative to try to do that together with the United States and Europe.
Niels, thank you. Tony, Rosa, China. China is a factor in transatlantic relations, a source of convergence, a source of divergence. How do you see it? Tony, go ahead.
I'm reference to, you said China. I'm sorry, you
China. Yes, sorry. Yeah, China.
Yeah. Well, look, yeah, absolutely. This is much talked about, but my view is it is the acid test. The EU and much of Europe doesn't like the United States to put it that way, but it's certainly in Congress, and I think a lot of US voters, and I think some administration will see China as the acid test of whether the EU and Europe is going to be an effective partner of the United States. And China, of course, is fanning the false narrative that the United States wants to gang up on China, that we're forcing Europe into an us or them, that we want to decouple. All that's false, is patently false. But the fact of the matter is that many will say, what good is Europe and what good is the EU if we can't work with them on the key issue facing us economically, politically, in terms of security? And we need to find ways either we can align, or where that's not possible, to reduce disalignment. I mentioned one area which is very important and is emerging as a key topic, and that's one of standards and standard setting. Because China has identified not only key technologies of the future, which it wants to dominate by 2035, but also dominating key standard setting organizations so they can write the rules and write the values worldwide and enshrine advantages for its exporters. But there are lots of other areas where I think we can and indeed need to work together quickly.
Rosa, convergence, divergence on China, bit of both?
I think a bit of both. I mean, the difference is that for the US, there is bipartisan consensus that China is the major challenge, okay? Whereas the EU is made up of 27 member states, each of which have different relationships with China. And China's been cultivating them in division at least for the past decade. So Europeans need to come together and see what they can offer to the United States. The second thing is that, and I think that's what's happening. I actually do think that's what's happening, and it's done in a more sectoral way. I mean, the Trade and Technology Council will also allow the EU to deconstruct all the traumatic and difficult issues that exist in the transatlantic relationship with respect to China, and they can address them, in a sectoral way, rather than with this sort of broad brush narrative that Europeans are not very comfortable with. The second thing is that I think perhaps the EU puts fighting the climate crisis perhaps higher up in the hierarchy of priorities, and that requires engaging with China. So the EU will propose itself as as having a dialogue with China, which already is existing, and perhaps can play a slightly different game compared to the United States when it comes to climate diplomacy, for instance. And that could be done in concert with the US. It doesn't need to be done in an alternative way to the US. But I also see that this administration, and this is where the big difference with the previous administration is, can hear that Europeans have, a diversity of relations with China. And Blinken said it, he doesn't expect full alignment, which is what the Trump administration expected. So I think divergence, but it's a manageable divergence. And coupled with the growing awareness of the degree to which China is encroaching on international norms, those international norms that are so critical for the existence of the EU, I think we're going to see a greater convergence, but with nuanced messages, nuanced rhetoric, and perhaps slightly different tactics.
Rosa, let me ask you this. I mean, you spend a lot of time thinking about this and writing about it. There has been a kind of, well, we have a new chapter, to take the title from our session, in a sense, I think, with the Biden administration. We'll see where it goes. But what about on the European side? What does Europe need to do differently? Tony alluded to this a little bit in saying that Europe has to help the Biden administration succeed. But what does Europe need to do differently to strengthen transatlantic relations at this point?
That's a good one. So
thank you.
So I think some things we're already seeing. A few. They're small changes. Europeans did not quarrel among themselves to get the first photo shot with Biden. They accepted that Biden would travel to Brussels, he would meet Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen, and that was that. So that's a big change, actually. If you remember with Obama, who was a superstar in Europe, of course, everybody wanted to meet him first. And that was a bit embarrassing, this sort of squabbles among EU member states. Secondly, I appreciate the fact that the EU put forward a proactive agenda back in December already to restart the transatlantic relationship. the EU does not like to be treated like the junior partner, but sometimes behaves in a way that calls for being treated as the junior partner. So I think it's important that the EU also has a proactive agenda in this regard. I would like to see, but this is perhaps my own personal preference due to what I've been looking at in my career, I would like to see stepping up of coordination, at least, or cooperation as well, between the EU and the US on all the issues that are have been burning in the EU's neighborhood. I'd like to see greater coordination on the Western Balkans, Turkey, North Africa, the Middle East, all these issues that, and Europeans have really struggled, and they've really struggled to reach common positions, and they've really struggled to push those into effective action. They have a lot of policies, but the struggle to implement them, or sometimes the policies are ill thought through. And I think that would be a good area where the US perhaps diplomatically rather than with military resources could actually support the EU. And that's where the EU needs to step up its responsibility. Because, you know, essentially, and this is the longer term message that we've seen from the US for the past decade or more even, the US wants to engage a bit more in Asia and a bit less in Europe. Therefore, Europeans need to step up their responsibilities here. If this could be through a sort of mentoring of the US, a diplomatic support, just to give a bit more push to the messages that's coming out from European national capitals, that would be good. And then, I mean, but this is what we all would like to see, greater unity on foreign policy within Europe. But I mean, that's a
subject for another session.
Yes, exactly.
I'm conscious of our time, but I did want to come to you, Niels and Tony, maybe on the same thing. You know, what can Europe do? You're sitting here in Europe. We're all in Europe at the moment. You know, what's Europe's responsibility in this? Strengthen transatlantic relations. Make sure this new chapter is a genuine one.
Yeah, I don't want to kickstart a new round of debate because we're lacking the time. I have many ideas, and I think most of them have been mentioned. And by the way, if I can comment on what Rosa said about EU's policies in the neighborhood, there's a good example of how it's already working. We are just preparing the second Libya conference for Berlin next week. We are expecting Secretary of State Blinken. So there's a concrete example of where a European, in this case, also a German initiative, now really enjoys the full support of the US administration, which is a good sign. And I think also a very visible policy in contrast to the old administration. But Ian, if I may say so, of course, Europe needs to do more in terms of security and defense, and in terms of the economic and technological questions on China. And I know that you discussed about many of those issues during the Brussels Forum. But I also want to mention that, you know, it was not us who left the transatlantic consensus. And I remember in many aspects, for example, talking about the Middle East, where it was a European initiative with the Munich format that we created to just choose one example, the two-state solution as a consensus alive, and it survived somehow the Trump years. We jumped in when humanitarian aid and assistance was cut, and we defended and we stood our ground in those United Nations agencies where the US withdrew and where we were in a way on our own dealing with China and others, because there's no vacuum in politics. So others are going to fill that vacuum. So my impression here is, yes, we need to have that discussion. And I completely agree. We have an interest that this Biden administration is going to be successful. But we are also sovereign countries. We also have our own interests. So the first priority and obligation is to make that work in our own country and in the European Union. So the responsibility doesn't lie alone with the Europeans. And so I'm sometimes a bit irritated by some of the think tank rhetoric after Biden's election, so about, and now Europe. you know, and I think my minister framed it in a good way. We are happy that the US is back, but we have been there all the time, and it was a difficult time. And maybe we also need to acknowledge that 4 years of Trump left a mark. It's not back to the good old days. We made a tremendous step forward in the last days, virtually in the last days. But nobody here knows what is going to happen at the next presidential election. And you cannot base a policy on your hope that Biden will be successful. Comeback of Trump or some of his associates is not going to be ruled out. And that's why I think the Europeans really need to get their act together. But you see me much more optimistic about the prospects. And so I think that should be the message, especially after the series of summits that you talked about.
Niels, thank you. Tony, a last word very briefly on perhaps to play off of what Niels has just said. What's one thing Europe can do? You should be sure to do.
Well, aside from the China issue, which I mentioned, where we need to work together more seriously, I would just mention two. One is continue to be a thought leader, Ian, and not just on the issues that we haven't really mentioned, like the DSM, the DSA, and artificial intelligence regulation, the hate speech, terrorist content, but actually saving trade liberalization, doing it the right way, and working together with us to see if we can be serious and effective about trade adjustment assistance. I think that's important. And the other quick thing I would say, Ian, this I'll stop, is don't beat up the United States in areas which are politically impossible. We've done both of that on both sides. I lived through it for 3 years. I call it talking point ping pong, which is totally unproductive. Let's be adults and understand that some areas where we simply cannot move, and let's not beat ourselves up about those. That's it.
Tony, thank you. And it's a wonderful way for us to end what I have to thank you for, because all of you, Niels, Rosa, Tony, that was a wonderful conversation, really terrific. We're going to have one more before we end Brussels Forum for 2021 and actually then have a closing. But it's a wonderful next session to be moderated by Susan Glasser, staff writer at The New Yorker, on democracy's next decade. But right before we do that, we're going to have a short coffee break. So do please stay tuned for that. It'll be terrific. Thanks again for joining us.